we have representatives from Women's Rights Network. And can I start by asking you each to introduce yourselves for the record, please, and I'll go left to right in order if I see them.
Claire Lonergan, WRN Director and Founder Member.
Cathy Larkman, WRN Founder Member, Wales Lead and National Policing Lead.
Catherine Owen, WRN Member and Lead for Cardiff and South East Wales.
Thank you for that. And can I thank WRN for the written evidence, which we obviously have considered and will be considering. And as a consequence, we have some further questions we would like to expand upon. Two questions for myself before I ask colleagues to come in. In your written evidence, you have sometimes quote some legal aspects. Can I ask whether you received legal advice on the bill as published, or is that just legal advice you've received on other matters generally?
We've scrutinised the bill in detail ourselves and, come to our conclusions in relation to that. We're familiar with the provisions of the Equality Act and obviously are mindful of the documents that are already in the public domain, including the Llywydd's statement.
Appreciate it. But just for clarity, and maybe just want to make this clarity, that's not separate legal advice you've sought on the particular bill?
No, that's our
that's
interpretation.
Okay, thank you. And can I just perhaps start with a simple question? Do you think legislative quotas will work or will not work based upon your interpretation of the Equalities Act 2010?
Well, what we're here to consider today are this particular bill as presented rather than legislative quotas per se. And on the basis of what is presented in this bill, we do not believe these gender quotas will work to improve the position of women in Wales. We've got many reasons for that. One of the reasons would be really that, aside from the sort of legality issues, this bill will do nothing to remove the structural barriers that women face in Wales. There are many capable and competent women out there. We believe that women deserve a seat at the table. We believe women should be represented in political life and have fair opportunity as well to be presented, to be able to represent themselves and the nation in political life. We don't believe this bill as drafted will actually provide that. And if I may say, in the last census, 22.3% of women in Wales stated they were disabled. In Wales, we have over 180,000 unpaid female carers. 46% of households living in poverty are lone parent households, and overwhelmingly the lone parent is a female. Those women will not be helped here. This bill will do nothing to remove the structural barriers facing those women, but it will help the women who either don't have those barriers or have already managed to overcome them to be prioritised.
Okay, so just for clarity again, the position you take is it's about the question is a use of quotas an appropriate mechanism to provide a greater gender balance within the Senedd? And if it is, clearly you view in this bill doesn't provide for a wider, you talk about structures, I understand what you're saying, but is this a process to actually start building that wider structure change that you are looking at, and do we need quotas to actually start that process off?
Well, I think the fact that needs to be pointed out here as well is that the Equality Act permits voluntary shortlists. The Equality Act does not permit mandatory quotas. And the Equality Act also allows certain acts of discrimination on the grounds of sex if they are a proportionate means to achieve a legitimate aim. The question whether this is a proportionate means to achieve a legitimate aim is very much up in the air, I would suggest, in relation to this bill. The Senedd, very proudly has obtained parity previously at 50-50, which is marvellous. Obviously, it's currently, my understanding, 43-57 in terms of, the difference between the sexes in terms of representation here. Basically, we've dropped by 4 female MSs. That shouldn't be insurmountable to the political parties represented here. You know, it should not be insurmountable. We've achieved it before, and this bill is a blunt tool that is unnecessary in our view, although we want fair representation and fair opportunities for the women of Wales.
Okay, thank you. Sarah.
Thank you for submitting your evidence as well today and being here. So just could you outline why you believe the quotas are not necessary and what potential consequences could result in the event if quotas are introduced? You've already outlined it, but I see in your written evidence you've gone into more depth about this. So if you could explain that to us a little bit more, that would be wonderful.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Yeah, of course. You know, I'm sure my colleagues may wish to come in if I don't cover all of this, but, you know, I can only look at the bill as it's currently drafted, you know, and it's unfortunate to say, you know, in our view, the bill is poorly drafted and we have concerns in relation to it. These aren't just the concerns of the Women's Rights Network in Wales. These concerns are shared by other women's groups as well, who I believe have submitted responses to the consultation, and, you know, particularly Merched Cymru, LGB Allies Cymru, Labour Women's Declaration and Women's Declaration International, just to name a few. So, you know, we're not alone in relation to that. And in terms of why we think this won't automatically help those women who need to be represented in political life, just to name a few factors really, the bill is not clarifying its terms. So I should say at the outset here, when the bill talks about the representation of women, our view is that women, in the absence of any clarity within this bill, should be as outlined in the Equality Act, and that's what we take it as. In section 212 of the Equality Act, a woman is a female of any age. And, you know, that's our view and our interpretation as to law. And if anything different is meant by those that have drafted the bill, or by Welsh Government, then that should be stated, you know, as soon as possible in very, very clear terms, so we all know exactly where we are. And in terms of the drafting of the bill, where we are really is that the bill caps, as I understand it, the number of men at 50%, but doesn't cap the number of women. Now, as I've said, the Equality Act allows, you know, discrimination on the grounds of sex, and as Professor Laura McAllister said to you the other day, sex is the protected characteristic here, not gender, as has been stated throughout the notes attached to the bill. So if you cap the men at 50%, you don't cap the women at 50%. Now, it may be thought that it would be unlikely to have 100% women representation, but that's not the way law should be drafted, on the basis of something might not happen and is likely and probably won't happen. You know, good law surely should consider the consequences and even the unintended consequences. And unfortunately, because in our view it's not a proportionate means to achieve a legitimate aim, it's just plain old sex discrimination then under the Equality Act, and, you know, is likely to be viewed as such. You know, I'm really grateful for the question. I mean, there's so much that could be said about it, but, you know, I'm sure we'll come on to the statement aspect of it, the statement that you're either woman or not a woman, because obviously we'll have quite a bit to say in relation to that as well.
That's right, my colleague Darren will be coming to that later, absolutely. Yes, was there anything else that you wanted to add though?
No, I think that covers it, thank you.
Okay, wonderful, thank you very much. And thank you, because it is about looking at the even unintended consequences, so it's very helpful to hear that. And then my second last question is, can you outline your views on the use of the terms of sex and gender in the bill and explanatory memorandum, as you just did? But you are right, we have received evidence that does say that it's very unlikely that it would happen, that you would have more women than men. Do you have any examples or anything that you can point to that shows where this has potentially happened before, or how likely you think this could happen in future?
Well, again, I'd say, you know, law as drafted should, you know, take account of what may or may not happen and is likely to happen. I mean, we know that if you create an incentivization for one sex, really, then that there aren't checks and balances to exist to manage, we know that that will be potentially abused. And clearly in legislation, that should be anticipated and taken care of at that early stage. I mean, I point, for instance, to there's a recent example in Spain where Spanish men have, because of a potential pension uplift available to women because of childbearing years, have made a declaration purely to obtain the pension uplift available to women, and we've referred to that in our consultation response. Similarly, in Mexico, it's happened in terms of gender quotas as well, where men have, obviously made a declaration to obtain that advantage, because if you're going to put men at a detriment to compare to women, don't be surprised then if you leave a gate wide open and they walk straight through it. And that has happened in Mexico, unfortunately. So, we'd be keen to see that prevented happening here. But unfortunately, the lack of clarity around the terminology used in the bill is only going to sort of really make that happen.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Chair.
Jane, you want to ask Brent?
Yeah, diolch yn fawr iawn. Just...
Thank you very much. I just wanted to ask a brief question in Welsh. And it's on that final point that you made in relation to the evidence from Mexico. Now, we heard from the earlier panel that there was one example which took place over 6 years ago of self-identification. Do you have any more evidence? Because we are interested in evidence. So you mentioned the situation in Mexico. Are there other examples that you could refer to?
Well, I think thank you for the question. I mean, obviously we've provided can I take these off now? My words are echoing back at me. It's not a good place to be. But obviously we've produced those particular two examples. But in relation to legislation more broadly, I think, everybody would be mindful really of how events played out in Scotland in terms of the GRR, the Gender Reform Recognition Bill. At no stage during the drafting of that bill would I like to think that senior ministers were having to defend a male rapist, Isla Bryson, going into a female prison, and yet that's exactly the position that ministers were in. So I do think, in terms of examples, it's very difficult, isn't it, really, to sort of resource lots more examples. But because, if the system doesn't allow the sort of challenges or the sanctions against it, then it's difficult to sort of pull up the actual evidence because, it's not going to be recorded. But what I would say is, how many instances would be enough? How many women displaced from political life would be enough? Do we need 100 women displaced before we decide this is not appropriate? Or is one woman too many? Because my view is one woman too many.
There's the example you gave as Mexico. I take the separate issue from the Scottish Gender Recognition Reform Bill. I understand what you're saying there, but at the moment you don't have any other evidence where quotas are being used in electoral systems other than the Mexico one?
I've quoted the examples in the consultation that we've got.
Thank you. On this point?
Yes, on this point, if I may. Can I just ask, thank you for giving evidence today as well. In your papers you've submitted, you've talked about the unintended consequences, and one of the comments made, which was paragraph 29, most women, like most men, want to be elected on merit, not because they tick a box. The use of quotas is likely to drive the belief that successful candidates are not good enough to be elected, otherwise reducing respect for MSs. Can I ask the basis of that statement regarding international examples? Because obviously we've heard a wide range of evidence which has shown perhaps an opposite view in terms of the use of quotas. So I'd just like to understand some of the evidence that's informed that view.
Well, I noticed the evidence. I'm sure if you sort of read on to paragraph 32, you'll be really mindful of two of the academic papers on which you know, a lot of the explanatory notes obviously point to quite a bit, Clayton and Cooper-Coles. Clayton herself says, and I will read it out obviously, just even though it's in the consultation document, the positive consequences of quotas are not guaranteed. Entering into men-dominated parliaments, quota-elected women often face gendered constraints in their legislative work, particularly when they attempt to reform policies that uphold traditional male authority. As such, researchers would do best to avoid any variant of the old add women and stir expectation that might predict universally salutary effects following women's rising numbers. So, you know, the evidence itself that the bill uses sort of says that, you know, to sprinkle in additional women is not going to overcome those difficulties for women.
If I may, sorry, the evidence there is on men-dominated parliaments, and your evidence obviously points to the fact that we have achieved 50-50 in the past here, and in terms of representation of 43 versus 57 now. So I'm just keen to delve to understand, you know, why, because some of the counter-evidence is there also in terms of the need for quotas. So I'm just interested to see from other examples why you disagree with some of those counter views, perhaps.
Well, I was very interested, and I'm sure you'll hear further on this soon. I attended the women's cross-party meeting, and there was an excellent presentation from Jennifer, I think it's Piscopa, who's done a lot of work in relation to this. I think sometimes if you ask the questions that you want to ask, you'll get the answers sometimes that you're seeking. And I was very interested in Ms. Piscopa's presentation of a 12-country-wide study around perceptions of legitimacy then of all-male legislatures and where 50% parity had been achieved. And obviously they asked the public what their perception was of an all-male legislature in terms of its legitimacy. And, you know, the scores, forgive me, I can't remember the scores or the remarks from the top of my head, but they were poor as you'd expect, as maybe you'd expect. And then where 50% parity were achieved, it was markedly better. But when the electorate or the people surveyed were told that it was a result of gender quotas, that actually dropped. Not hugely, but the legitimacy perception actually dropped. What was interesting for me is that in nowhere in that did they ask what the public's perceptions of an all-female legislature would actually look like in terms of legitimacy, particularly if it had been achieved through an uncapped gender quota system. Now, I think women are capable of everything. I think we are as good as men in political life, and we should be given that platform to achieve. And those excellent women who are, you know, who might put themselves forward, we should be helping them to come forward. But I don't see anything in this bill that help those women who are not coming forward. We know from the statistics and from what we've quoted in this consultation that where women do come forward, the electorate vote for them. You know, that will happen. So it seems to me that the problem here is that it's not an electoral issue, it's a candidature issue. There are insufficient candidates. You know, and for me, that's where the work needs to take place, rather than the blunt instrument of a gender quotas bill. We need to be working on why there are insufficient candidates, why all those excellent women who aren't coming forward, who may face those barriers that I've already sort of referred to, why aren't they coming forward? And what are we doing to help them? What are all the parties doing to help them?
One questions from Darren.
Yeah, I'm very interested in the point you made about gender quotas being potentially disproportionate if they were applied in this way, because potentially, in theory, it could lead to 100% female or women represented in the Senedd. And no men, and that would be regarded as okay. Do you want to just tell me a little bit more about this disproportionate issue? And also, you seem to imply in your evidence that while you don't like this bill, clearly, that you do support gender quotas, but on a voluntary basis. Would I be correct in saying that? And that would be if gender quotas were female and male gender quotas rather than people who identified themselves as women?
Well, I think the first thing we'd say is that those quotas must use clear language and be based on sex. Unfortunately,
Yeah.
you know, as Professor McAllister, you know, pointed out only too well to you, you know, that, you know, since she formed the recommendations on the expert panel, there's been much discussion of the protected characteristic of sex and the tendency to use the term gender instead. And she certainly reflected, you know, her thoughts in relation to that. So the first thing I would say is that the language needs to be clear, and it needs to be, you know, if the Welsh Government mean anything differently to the normal definition under Section 212 of the Equality Act as a female of any age, they need to sort of specify that. But I think your question was about, you know, what our views are really in
Yes.
terms of voluntary or mandatory
Yes.
quotas. The Equality Act allows for voluntary shortlists
Yes.
on the basis of sex. It doesn't allow that to be conflated with any of the other protected characteristics. You know, I'm mindful the EHRC have, you know, provided their own sort of short consultation response to the Reform Bill Committee as well, and I know you'll have all seen and read that. But, you know, the way the bill is drafted, and I just repeat again, you know, the men are capped, women are not capped. And there's insufficient clarity around the term women, not a woman, and what will happen in relation to those statements.
So that's why you feel it could be disproportionate. But again, I just go back to this issue. So if it were to be clear on the face of the bill that woman was what is stated in the Equalities Act, female of any age, would you then be content? So if the bill said we needed gender quotas that were 50-50, okay, in terms of zipping, that didn't allow more than 50% men or more than 50% women to be elected to the Senedd, or didn't, or decrease the possibility of that significantly, would you then be happy with the bill?
Well, I think we'd have to look at the bill on its own merits as drafted then. And I would say this for, you know, for our members of the Women's Rights Network in Wales, and I'm sure it's the case for the other women's groups as well, we will have members who will be very much in favour of legislated quotas on the basis of sex, and we'll have members who won't be in favour of legislated quotas on the basis of sex. You know, that's the way representation works, you know, and women are not a homogenous being that we all share the same views. We in WRN, you know, welcome a variety of views, and as I often say, we've got representatives of, or, you know, actual sort of political representatives as opposed to supporters of all the political parties in Wales in our network.
So you have a position on this bill as drafted,
yes,
but you don't have a wider position on gender quotas per se, because of the diversity of opinion.
We think the most important thing is that any bill as drafted should comply with the law and be within legislative competence and be cognizant, fully cognizant of the Equality Act.
And presumably, given that you're a women's rights network, you're alarmed at the suggestion that this bill could effectively give rights to men who claim to be women, who are trans women. You know, tell us your views on this gender statement requirement that candidates have to put forward. So it's not that you have to identify whether you're a man or a woman, it's you have to identify whether you are a woman or not a woman, and it allows people to self-identify at the point that they become a candidate. What's your view on whether that is appropriate or not?
Well, our view is, you know, and I know I've said this multiple times, that in the absence of clarity from Welsh Government, a woman is, as defined by the Equality Act, a female of any age. You know, the fact is, you know, regardless of people's, you know, identities, etc., that this bill as drafted will provide an incentive for men to make a false statement. Because, you know, as I see from the details of the bill, there is, well, it's stated, isn't it? There is no sanction within the bill for falsifying that statement. So if there's no sanction, what would stop an ambitious man making that statement one day? What's going to happen then if the next week that's all forgotten about, and he's back to being, you know, as he normally would state he is. You know, there is nothing in this bill that would deal with that. So, you know, why wouldn't a man take advantage of that? Why on earth wouldn't that happen?
So I mean, you're talking there about someone who might make a false statement or claim to be a woman at the time that they become a candidate and then choose to live their life as a man thereafter, yes? As they were previously.
Well, I would go further and say they don't need to do anything other
And simply
than sign the statement, make the statement. They don't have to live as anything before, during or after.
They just sign a statement. You know, there is no additional detail.
I mean, the Minister has suggested that the way to resolve situations like that would be in the courts in her first evidence session with us. Do you think that's a sensible thing?
No, I would, you know, I would advocate more strongly against that. I would consider that to be, you know, really remiss at this stage in legislation, and that, you know, and in terms of the reputation as well of the Welsh Government, you know, that if we were having bun fights throughout the court on individual cases in relation to this. And of course, the other concerning thing, without knowing, you know, a huge amount about constitutional matters, is, you know, what about other candidates? If these individual, you know, other candidates in positions where challenges were then being made about the correctness of these statements, will it then throw into doubt any sort of electoral results? So, you know, it's got quite profound consequences for everybody, and it's just very important that the detail is right at this stage. You know, this is supposed to be, on the face of it, about helping women. You know, that's what it's supposed to be about, and we'd be fully, you know, we want to help women in Wales, as I've sort of said numerous times, but this bill doesn't do it.
If I could just add to that regarding the statement from the Minister saying, oh, well, you know, if that happens, then the appropriate resolution will be through the courts. Well, surely the purpose of resolving something through the courts would be if a loophole is discovered subsequently, rather than to allow a loophole to be legislated and then have it, well, why not close it now? If you have the opportunity at a pre-legislative stage, rather than say, oh, well, the courts will have to determine that.
Especially when you're sort of fully aware of it, and it's sort of, it's already been flagged up on numerous occasions. Just, it seems
I mean,
an unserious way of dealing with things.
The Minister seemed to be adamant that the Welsh Government had no intention of wanting to define what a woman is for the purpose of the legislation, and that ought to be a matter for the courts to decide if a challenge was made. What she also didn't have a response to was those individuals who may be gender fluid, for example, who may regard themselves to be a woman one day and a man the next. I mean...
Well, this is where, you know, it's really important that it is stated and made very clear that this is based on sex as a protected characteristic, because there will be women, females, who claim to identify as something different to their, you know, their registered sex at birth and their sex. You know, how is this going to affect them? And as you say, you know, individuals who believe they are fluid in their identities, what is going to happen in relation to them? You know, it's just, you know, I just feel it's very, very messy, it's vague, and it's preventable.
So it's obviously a gift to lawyers, isn't it? Can I just come on to this issue about...
Not a gift to the Welsh taxpayer,
not a gift to the
I
Welsh
have to say in court.
Can I just come on to this issue of data protection? So you make reference in your evidence to the fact that you don't believe that there is a sensitivity around these statements, and that they ought to be publicly available to people to be able to probe. In the explanatory memorandum provided by the government, they say that there may be some sensitivity about individuals who have to identify themselves as either a woman or not a woman at the point of their candidature. Why do you not believe that the statements should be considered sensitive for data protection
Because
purposes?
that's what the Information Commissioner's Office say. You know, sex is not sensitive information, but, you know, obviously gender reassignment would be, but sex is not. So there is no need to, you know, hide that data if this bill is based on a person's sex.
And just to be clear, you believe that if this bill is to proceed, it needs to be clear that for the purposes of the legislation, woman means female of any age.
As per the definition
Adult
in the
female
Equality Act and as outlined by CEDAW as well, which, you know, this government, you know, is also cognizant and supportive of the CEDAW declaration.
I need to move on.
Yes, just in terms of sanctions now, if I may. So you're quite, you rightly identify that the bill does not make it a corrupt practice to make it a false statement in relation to whether someone's a woman or not a woman at the point that they make, you know, they submit their papers to become a candidate. What sort of sanctions do you think that there ought to be on the bill?
Well, I should certainly think prohibition from standing for that particular seat if you make a sort of false statement. Any views?
I mean, I don't think WRN have a particular view on what would be appropriate.
But you believe that there are insufficient sanctions at the moment on the bill for those who choose to make a false statement?
Well, there's a lack of detail in relation to sanctions is probably the correct statement to make, because there is no sanction for falsifying a statement, none whatsoever. So
it should be commensurate with other sanctions for falsifying candidates' details.
Which would be the corrupt practices sort of legislation. So add it to the schedule of corrupt practices for the purposes of elections. Okay, thank you very much.
And I suppose it should be said at this point as well, which is why that definition, the Equality Act, is so important, and it must be pointed out. The self-identification is not the law in the UK. It is not the law in Wales. And, you know, clearly we're mindful of the Llywydd's comments already. We're mindful of the EHRC's comments, and, you know, that would very much put, you know, a very firm, well, more than a footstep into self-identification and the whole world of legislative competence issues.
Thank you.
Jane?
Yeah, definitely.
Thank you very much.
Very quick question in English, because I think we've covered quite a bit that I wanted to talk about. You've made it very clear around your concerns around the structural issues facing women here in Wales and in the UK. But given that we have a bill here just looking at 50-50 gender quotas, I'm just interested in what else you think can be done, particularly around political parties, to look at a better gender representation in the Senedd. It was 20 years ago that we had our last 50-50 parliament here in Wales. So what, in your view, what else should be done by political parties to improve the representation of women? Interested in hearing from all of the panel. Diolch, Marianne. Thank you.
Well, I know my colleague will come in here on one particular matter in a moment, but my view would be, you know, the first thing that I would say, and I'm really glad that we are speaking to you today, is, you know, for those groups that haven't necessarily had this platform before and who have asked and asked and asked to be represented at meetings and to have a platform, you know, they represent women of Wales as well. They will have a very firm view, as will I really, that the women's groups that have been listened to have come from a very small cohort of particular beliefs and, you know, particular consensus. It's healthy in a democracy to listen to different views. We have different views within the Women's Rights Network, certainly within the Women's Rights Network in Wales. The other groups will experience the same as well. So I'd say one of the first things that should happen if you want to encourage women to stand up and be represented in public life is to actually speak to those women's groups and not shut them out, and, you know, not present them as some sort, you know, as has happened in some quarters, as, you know, somehow, you know, unworthy to have the political stage or to have the public stage. And I'd say that's the first step that's incumbent upon every political party represented at the Senedd. And I know you wanted to make a point.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that we see is that when they stand for election, women are elected more readily than men. And the problem isn't that women aren't getting elected, it's that they're not even standing, they're not even arriving as candidates. So to increase the number of candidates would be the first step. So how do you do that? Well, mentoring, reaching out to women's groups, encouraging people, women in particular, to come forward. So rather than seeking to make sure that those that are already candidates get elected, to boost the number of female candidates.
Thank you. Just two small points I'd like to make. With the issue around quotas not addressing the structural inequality, I think the issue with quotas is what you are doing is you are engaging with the engaged, and you enable women who are already engaged within the political system to then become candidates and then obviously get elected. And so it doesn't address the grassroots issue. And I also think that political parties need to be very honest and robust with themselves about identifying and rooting out where there may be inherent misogyny within parties. And I think we're all aware that that has been an issue in Wales, and we'd be very, very keen for a frank examination of that by the parties.
Thank you very much, Diolch yn fawr, Cadeirydd.
Moving on, but just for clarity purposes, I think your answer referred to the Llywydd referring to self-identification in her comments. She just referred to the competency issue of the bill and made no comment on self-identification for clarity purposes. Heledd.
Thank you very much. I will be asking my questions in Welsh. Now, in looking at diversity and inclusion and following on from Catherine's final point, perhaps, do you therefore believe that there's no need for any kind of mechanism in order to get more women and more diversity in the Senedd? You talk of the need for parties to do more with the grassroots and don't accept that quotas will change things, but what would lead to that change? What would you suggest as an alternative system?
I'd say, certainly a commitment that is, recorded and actionable and time-scaled with each of the parties around voluntary shortlists that actually, means something. That there's an active sort of mentoring programme as well locally within parties, including within, constituency areas. So I'd certainly say this is doable. I keep saying this, but it is doable. We're not in a dire situation. We're not in the situation, for example, of Ireland when they introduced quotas. 15% of women in the legislature in Ireland when they introduced quotas. We're not that far off parity. So to be bringing in such a dramatic measure to move things forward just seems a lot. Anybody else want to add anything?
Sorry, can I just pick up on that point? So
Yep.
you think that actually just asking political parties to do more would be sufficient?
No, I think it's incumbent upon women's groups as well to sort of to hold events, to have discussions between themselves, to seek out their elected representatives, and to work with political parties really to sort of help channel women into politics, and particularly young women, because we know that young women, yourselves accepted, obviously young compared to me, are not necessarily represented in the political arena. So I think there's a lot that can be done there. I think we need to remove structural barriers that prevent single mothers being able to sort of, put themselves forward and be active in political life. They may be financial measures, they may be measures that assist with their time, creche at the Senedd, for example, good working hours at the Senedd to help those women. What does disability access look like here? How are disabled women empowered to stand for, political office, not just here, but obviously back in the areas that they represent as well. So that there's, and women from other diverse protected characteristics as well. Specific programs of work, and I think women's groups should be heavily involved in that, and we should be looking perhaps spending our money and our time and effort to reducing those structural barriers.
Do you feel there's any kind of legislation that we should be introducing to support everything that you've outlined, which I'd hope everyone agrees that we need to enable everyone to be able to participate in our democracy? So is there anything specific? Because obviously when things are left to chance, if you look at a local authority level, we're not anywhere near being on par compared to what you say in terms of the Senedd. And many women don't choose to continue as elected representatives, often perhaps stand for one term rather than continue. So
we should understand better, I think, what is preventing women from standing, understand better why women are dropping out, because unless you know what those reasons are, what underlies it, then you're pretty much clutching at straws if you try and implement legislation to address it. Once you know what the problems are, then you can start implementing legislation that will tackle them. So it feels a bit cart before the horse.
Yeah, it's hard to sort of predict the legislation that you'd need without that work to sort of speak to the women and identify the evidence first.
Yes, and obviously we're considering the whole breadth of evidence and have been presented with evidence to look in the main there. Are there any additional comments you'd like to make in terms of the capacity of the bill to increase the representation of women here? Or do you feel you've covered everything?
I feel we've probably covered all the points that we want to make, but
okay,
just look at my colleagues.
Oh, no more from me.
Sarah, you had a supplementary?
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you so much for your evidence as well today. This has been really, really helpful. I guess I just wanted to, in response to what you've been saying about, it's about getting the candidates, completely agree, and your evidence that you've submitted absolutely supports that. I guess when I talk about my own party here now, Welsh Labour, we do have a BAEM committee, a person, a representative on the Welsh Executive. We have women's officers and committees and forums. We have a women's conference annually where we provide a creche. We have representatives on our Welsh Executive Committee for Disability, for LGBT. We have mentoring programmes. We have funds for women to be able to apply for. And yet, we cannot seem to do it. We cannot seem to do it. And I guess that there's 17 Welsh Labour women here at the moment, but my count is only a handful came through on a non-all-women shortlist mechanism. So I guess, you know, let's not forget, we began with quotas, and ever since we have not had the quotas, we have lost and lost and lost, and we have not benefited or increased in those other diverse areas. And I suppose that that's why the call is for the gender quota. So I guess my final question would be, do you really think that we should just scrap this? Because, and I understand your points about the competency, I really do, and just continue with what we have, because there is an argument that that is just not working.
Well, I think there's certainly a disparity between some of the parties in how this has worked previously. And, you know, I notice you refer to quotas. I think it's shortlists, isn't it, that the Labour Party have done rather than quotas.
We have shortlists, and once we get to a certain point, then we can't use them anymore.
No, because the Equality Act says that once you achieve 50% parity on shortlists, that you don't proceed any further, you know, that you've achieved parity, obviously. So, yeah, but Labour have achieved it, and I sort of I do appreciate your frustrations. You know, it is very, very difficult to say, you know, what is going wrong, you know. It's interesting that you mention women's officers. You've got women's officers. Mm-hmm. It's not always the answer, because we know nationally, and I'm not specifically referring to Wales, but we know nationally there are men in women's officers' posts, and there's nothing to prevent men sitting in women's officers' posts. But then that maybe tells you something about how successful the Labour Party has been really in sort of dealing with those women's officers' posts and getting women into them. So, you know, clearly things are going wrong. I think it's incumbent upon all the parties to look very, very hard at themselves, to look at what the political sort of landscape and life day to day looks like for female representatives in terms of misogyny, sexual harassment, you know, abuse, and all the other sort of, you know, extremely unwelcome things that happen, particularly for female candidates, and whether that is putting them off.
Dan, I'll give you the last question.
Yeah, just one final question. I asked the previous panel this as well. Do you think that there ought to be, the one step forward that could be taken would be a statutory requirement for every political party to produce a diversity action plan of sorts, so that, you know, and that's set out in terms of what needs to be included in that plan? That'd be helpful.
I keep going back to the Equality Act. The Equality Act allows you, you know, to discriminate on the basis of sex as a proportionate means to achieve a legitimate aim. It doesn't allow you to discriminate on the basis of any of the other protected characteristics. And, you know, parties should be, you know, at the very ethos of every political party should be fairness, transparency, openness and accountability, rather than, you know, an action plan that says you must have a representative of this, must have a representative of that, you know, how many subcategories do you go down into, you know. I think you're in a very sort of difficult arena personally if you were to do that. But in terms of like the overall commitment to of a party to be fair, we just want fairness as women. I suppose that's what I want to come back to. We just want fairness, you know. Wherever we are, you know, wherever our sort of social status is, wherever our financial status is, we want fairness in political representation rather than tick box targets, which is what, forgive me, you seem to be perhaps potentially alluding to.
I think, look, I'll be blunt with you. I don't think my party has done enough on the diversity agenda. It's taken some positive steps. You know, we have some of the things in place that the Labour Party has, for example, but there are other things probably that we ought to be doing. It may well be the same in the Labour Party and other aspects of diversity. So I'm simply suggesting that it might be helpful if there was a statutory requirement for every party to produce a diversity action plan to show that it's making progress on this diversity agenda.
I think you know, to comment on that, I would need to see the details of that diversity action plan. You know, there's been a lot, you know, where plans have been drawn up in other organisations. You know, those sort of plans and commitments have caused a lot of problem, a lot of mischief, have not always been compliant with the law, have resulted in court cases. So I think I would need to see the detail.
Okay, thank you.
So, in a sense, Section 106 of the Equality Act, which requires parties to actually produce data on diversity, and it needs to be enacted by a minister of the government and the UK government at this stage, you believe that should actually be now enacted, so we can at least start collecting the data to ensure that when action plans come forward?
Of course.
Okay, thank you.